The Honourable Member for Calgary Confederation.
Madam Speaker, it is my pleasure to rise today to speak to Bill C-230, the Protection of Freedom of Conscience Act. My colleague from Carlton Trail, Eagle Creek, has worked hard to bring this legislation forward, and I applaud her for doing so.
Hear, hear.
Right off the bat, though, I do want to say that my honourable colleague and I come at these issues from opposite ends, but I thank her for encouraging me to share a different perspective on the matter. Madam Speaker, I support a woman's right to seek an abortion, and I always will. And I support Canadians having access to medically assisted dying, and I always will. In fact, I proudly supported the legislation that made access to medically assisted dying possible several years ago. However, I also respect that medically assisted death is not acceptable for a large number of Canadians, especially those who hold strong religious convictions where their teachings prohibit such acts. So today I find myself standing strongly to defend those who disagree with my fundamental beliefs. If we want others to defend our rights and freedoms, we have to be willing to defend theirs.
Hear, hear.
Rights and freedoms are a two-way street. As I said in 2016 when I debated MAID, I said, this is a complex issue for which there are strong opinions on both sides. So, trying to solve and encapsulate such complex emotional issues into legislation is always a challenge, and it will never be perfect. As such, I strongly supported the original legislation requirement that there be a review at the 5-year mark to re-evaluate the legislation. I feel that this thorough re-evaluation has never taken place and breaks faith with the spirit of the original legislation. So I would strongly urge this Liberal government to undertake a deep review of the MAID legislation and address its shortcomings. The trust of Canadians is being put to test, and it does not have to be this way. Madam Speaker, I have also been a very strong advocate for palliative care and will continue to be. My dear friend Lou Winthers, who worked for me in my constituency office for many, many years, was the executive director of Rosedale Hospice in Calgary. My family and I volunteered here and saw directly the importance of palliative care. Also, my late father-in-law, David McDonald, was the executive chef at the Rosedale Hospice in Calgary. He spent much of his long life career as an executive chef in many of the prime hotels throughout this country, and he spent his final years cooking for the dying in this hospice. As many members know, I was widowed when my wife passed away from breast cancer. Now that journey, more than any other, showed me that palliative care is necessary and timely access to it is critical. In fact, one of the conditions on which I supported MAID was that we simultaneously and strongly support palliative care. One cannot replace the other. They are both needed. The fact is that palliative care remains grossly underfunded, and access is a hit and miss depending on where you live and when you need it. Both MAID and palliative care rely on medical professionals. These professionals are people, real people, with personal beliefs, personal convictions, and personal experiences. I can understand that not all medical professionals support abortion or MAID, and I support their belief that they should not be forced to perform certain procedures that put them at odds with their conscience, their beliefs, and their community. Quite frankly, Madam Speaker, I would not want to have a procedure performed on me by anyone who did not believe in what they were doing, would you? Would it not be better to know if your doctor or nurse was willing to put 100% effort into their work before the procedure started? Protecting conscience rights ensures that both the patient and the medical staff are fully informed and aware of issues when giving consent. And I don't need to go into details to explain the importance of informed consent in the medical process, but I do believe conscience rights protections are an important aspect of the whole informed consent process. Madam Speaker, the whole process of dying is deeply personal and individually unique. Sometimes you have experiences with the dying that leave lasting impressions, and I feel compelled to share one with you here tonight. On a Thursday in August of 2020, my constituent Sophia Lang wrote to me to tell me that she had just been approved for MAID. She said, and I quote, "You have no idea how much peace of mind that gives me, that there is a merciful way out of needless pain and suffering. I thank the Lord each day that I have that option for when life is no longer worth living." And she went on to say, "However, there's a problem. One needs to have mental faculties to be able to consent at the very end. That is a reason that many people, and I may be one of them, choose to activate MAID early, for fear of being unable to consent at the end. I wish you, as my representative in Parliament, to help improve the law so that advance directives are made legal, and many people would be able to live longer and at peace." Unquote. So, Madam Speaker, imagine my shock when I later learned that we had these exchanges in her last days. She died just 4 days after our last exchange, as I learned this through the Calgary Herald obituaries. She never mentioned how close she was to leaving this world in any of our emails. So I found it so powerful that when she had so little time left on this earth, she spent precious moments advocating for those who would follow her footsteps. Sophia has been gone now for 2 years, but her voice is not silent. I will continue to support access to MAID, advocate for proper advance directives, and strongly call for a better palliative care system in Canada. At the same time, I will defend and speak for those who have conscious objections to these procedures. I truly believe, as a society, we must find a way to give Canadians something without taking something away from others. Protection of conscious rights does just this by ensuring lawmakers can, in good conscience, give access to certain medical procedures without unjustly compromising the existing freedoms exercised by others. As a Democrat politician and American lawyer, Joe Andrew, famously said, the hardest decisions in life are not between good and bad or right and wrong, but between two goods or two rights. So I believe that we can find a common ground on these issues, and we must. We need to find a way to make rights compatible, to find a way to give something to some without taking away from others. So I call on all members of this House to support this bill into committee. I think it's an important conversation we need to have as a Parliament. Again, I understand my colleague and I have fundamental disagreements on issues like MAID and abortion, but I hope we have demonstrated to our colleagues here that when members do share common ground on an issue like conscious rights, we owe it to Canadians to work together. Thank you. Madam Speaker, I further would like to say the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation is an opportunity to make Canada better. It is a moment to reflect on our failures of the past, the impacts it continues to have today, and how we can bring about the healing that is required. We are a nation of nations, a people of peoples, and we have an opportunity to use this occasion to better ourselves and our country. I hope all Canadians reflect on their individual and our collective responsibilities to bring about changes that are needed. True truth and reconciliation is our shared path to a better Canada. Thank you.
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Member for Thornhill.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in support of Bill C-230 presented in this House by my friend and my colleague, the member from Carleton Trail, Eagle Creek. And the bill we're debating today, I think, is worth more than a casual dismissal, as I've listened to in this debate by so many. The bill, if supported, would provide the protections for charter rights of medical professionals who object to providing or participating in medical assistance in dying, something that many Canadians are concerned aren't there. This is not a debate about medically assisted dying, to which my own convictions are based on a deeply held personal experience, one that I wouldn't wish on anyone in this House. I think it's also insulting to hear some members in this House think that it's an exercise in politics. It is a debate that is often used in the simplification of applying a litmus test of carelessly sifting people into a bucket on how they see a very complex societal issue. Some so easily assign a check mark or an X to. I also support a women's right to choose. I always have. I always will. I support the LGBT community, their rights, and not as a check mark, but as someone who is a proud member of it. Canadians have varied opinions on MAID based on deeply held personal circumstances, beliefs, and experience. One member in this House said that before opposing these important provisions in the bill that aims to codify in law, saying he simply didn't see them, before he simply said he didn't see the need for them. But I do want to reiterate and emphasize some points that are important to this conversation and should be important to members of this House and Canadians alike. Medical assistance in dying is a deeply held, moral, and conscientious issue that has legal and ethical questions beyond a simple difference of opinion. We know that from the debates in this House. And the medical professionals have a duty to do what is in the best interest of their patients and provide them with the best advice on how to move forward with their care. And I will tell you that this is personal, and I will tell you that I went through it. And in this case of medical assistance in dying, there are professional and ethical considerations that should be weighed with the highest degree of importance, and a caution that touches on the deep moral convictions to which I don't believe have been adequately addressed in the current context of our laws. That said, this bill aims to add 2 new offenses to the criminal code. Not pronounce on whether conscious rights protections are somehow up for debate. They are not, despite some members suggesting that this bill will aim to do things that it will not do. I do believe that it's important to state what my colleague and those before her who brought this to the House in a piece of legislation, what it actually says, and not fall into an issue that we're not debating today. The bill does, one, it makes the offense to intimidate a medical practitioner for the purpose of compelling them to take part directly or indirectly in the provision of medical assistance in dying. And 2, it also makes it an offense to dismiss or refuse to employ the medical practitioner on that same basis. The debate suggests that the provisions in the criminal code already do this, and that's simply not the case. And while the criminal code does not compel a medical professional to provide MAID, there is nothing in the criminal code that specifically protects medical professionals when they are pressured or coerced into participating or advising of medical assistance in dying. Not wanting to discuss this doesn't make the conversation go away. The bill is a direct response to disability rights groups who are calling for these provisions and who understand firsthand that it is a problem. This bill is a direct response to the First Nations groups who have called for this, understanding that it is a problem. This bill is a direct response to legal experts. It is a response to mental health professionals who understand that this is a problem. So saying that it is not a problem does not make it not a problem. This bill will make certain that medical professionals who choose not to take part in or refer a patient for assisted suicide or medical assistance in dying will never be forced to, or coerced to violate their charter rights. The Ontario Medical Association specifically called for an amendment like this in the bill passed by this government to provide greater conscious protections for medical professionals, acknowledging that although the current clause in the government's bill for greater certainty, as it says, exists, it doesn't actually do the thing that it's supposed to do, which is protect freedom. It cannot actually be enforced. That's the problem this bill will correct. This bill from my colleague, who she has brought to this floor for debate. This bill addresses a gap it addresses the gap and that it would be closed by establishing 2 spelled out and very targeted offenses. And the stakeholders are calling on those additional safeguards, and any discussion of answering this call shouldn't be callously dismissed. It should be thoughtfully considered on behalf of all Canadians, and certainly those who have asked for provisions like this. Members opposite have stated throughout the debate of a jurisdictional argument, and that it somehow infringes on provincial jurisdiction, which is hard to see as anything but political when you argue that conscience rights legislation somehow interferes with jurisdiction while simultaneously believing that the legalization of medical assistance in dying doesn't do the same thing. Now, back to the code for a second, and the notion that existing provisions in the criminal code already produce satisfactory protections, which, if that were the case, this bill wouldn't be necessary. But I do believe that that notion ought to be challenged because it is simply not the case. The evidence from those affected shouldn't trump the dismissal of evidence from politicians claiming to be trivial or worse, not even acknowledged. I say that this bill would do just as much to protect patients as it does medical professionals, and I think that's something that hasn't been talked about. And by protecting the fundamentally important relationship between a physician and a patient, it would do so by ensuring that the advice that their physician is providing is free and clear of coercion, or should be a priority, not a landmine that we can't discuss. We should have these discussions here because they're important and the provisions don't exist as they currently talk about in the code. There have been laws that created unintended consequences of doctors being forced to participate in providing a patient's death, regardless of whether they believed that it was in that patient's best interest or not. And the current provisions can't possibly claim that the criminal code already protects conscience rights in medical professionals, not if you read the code. The clause I mentioned only confirms that the criminal code is not the source of obligation to participate. It doesn't state it as an offense. So it must actually articulate it as an offense in order for people to effectively deal with it as an offense, in order to enforce it. That's what we're talking about. And without conscience rights, doctors are constrained to provide medical assistance in dying, regardless of whether it is their professional opinion or it is in the best interest of the patient, regardless of their moral or ethical or personal convictions, regardless of their own beliefs. And without the necessary protections for them, they may be coerced, they may be intimidated, and those rights would have no value as a result. Many of us today might be or might have been in a situation where a loved one has a difficult choice to make about their health. And why would we not want our loved ones to receive the best possible care, the most options, the best options from good doctors based on advice that hasn't been colored by possible intimidation? Over the past years, we have seen just how much Canadians depend on our healthcare system and how crucial doctors and medical professionals who work in that system have been. Every Canadian, or at least a number of Canadians, have experienced it or are experiencing now that the system is important, and making sure that that system works is even more important. We need to create a work environment for medical professionals that protects them, that supports them, that encourages them, and that attracts the most qualified people possible to the profession. I would encourage members in this House to support the passage of this Protection of Freedom of Conscience Act. And I hope that those with deeply held conviction would understand why my honourable colleague or what she is trying to achieve for both patients, doctors, and those wanting to see them protected. Thank you.
The honourable member for Carleton Trail, Eagle Creek.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, for the opportunity to close the debate on my bill, the Protection of Freedom of Conscience Act. Madam Speaker, I believe this is a straightforward piece of legislation. It would make it an offense to intimidate a medical professional to participate in medical-assisted suicide, directly or indirectly, or dismiss from employment or refuse to hire a medical professional simply because they refused to take part in medically assisted dying. With the removal of safeguards, the slippery slope that many predicted when medical assisted suicide was decriminalized has come to fruition. Additionally, the courts and government legislation have expanded medical assisted suicide far beyond what was conceived in the Carter decision of 2015. Now, those who promote euthanasia support medical assisted suicide for the mentally ill, with some even believing that children should be eligible. This is creating turbulent and stressful times for many in the medical field. Given this expansion of medical assistance in dying, there is a growing concern or objection for many medical professionals, whether they support MAID or disagree with it, that they may be forced to participate, even if they do not believe it is in a particular patient's best interest, based on their expertise and knowledge of the patient's history. More and more are becoming aware of the erosion of respect for their professional judgment and the precious relationship between the healthcare provider and their patient. Unlike what some are trying to portray, this bill does not relitigate the legality of MAID, nor does it seek to impede a patient's access to MAID. Rather, it seeks to protect a medical professional's charter right to not participate in medical-assisted suicide when they can't, in good conscience, do so. Section 2 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms specifically says, and I quote, "Everyone has the following fundamental freedoms: freedom of conscience and religion." During the first hour of debate, my colleague, the member for St. Albert, Edmonton, reminded us that the Supreme Court's ruling in the Carter decision was predicated on two things, and I quote, "a willing patient, and just as importantly, a willing physician." He went on to note that in the decision, the Supreme Court stated the following, and I quote, "We note that a physician's decision to participate in assisted dying is a matter of conscience and, in some cases, religious belief." Madam Speaker, protecting individuals from coercion of this nature is not foreign to the Criminal Code of Canada, as found in Section 425. If Parliament can enshrine criminal penalties for employers for coercing employees not to form a union, surely we can provide similar protection for medical professionals when dealing with conscience protections. Throughout the pandemic, we saw just how important every doctor, nurse, and medical support worker is to our system. I don't want even one of these amazing men and women to leave Canada or leave the profession because they are faced with a situation of having one of their most precious rights being violated. With Bill C-230, I have put forward comprehensive yet simple legislation that is important to medical professionals from coast to coast. I would welcome a committee's examination of it, as well as any recommendations to improve it. In closing, Madam Speaker, it is an honor to have introduced a private member's bill of substance and consequence in this place, and to have members debate it. I humbly ask all members to vote in favor of it at second reading so that it can be sent to committee for further study. Thank you, Madam Speaker.